problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one bag into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
Okay, well, hi everybody, and welcome to Romantic Circle's Pedagogies Hangout. And today we're really excited to be doing a special hangout that's been long in the planning stage, but then came together really quickly like this. So we're super excited. I'm David Ruderman. I'm one of the co-editors of Romantic Circle's Pedagogies Commons, and this is the fourth of the hangouts that we've done so far. And we're really excited. Today we have two excellent guests, and this particular hangout, we're going to be talking about teaching prosody in the Romanticism classroom. And we're construing both those things as largely as possible, prosody and Romanticism. And we're probably, maybe what the thing to say is we're approaching them as largely as possible and as minutely as possible at the same time, trying to really get at the ways that which we teach prosody in a practical sense, but also how that has changed during our time of teaching and the way that it's changed in our discipline, et cetera. So I'll go ahead and introduce everybody now. First, I'll introduce Stephanie Kuduk Weiner, and she is professor of English at Wesleyan. She's published a ton of articles, excellent articles, and also has two books. One book is Clare's Lyric, John Clare and Three Modern Poets, and that's on Oxford UP in 2014. And I believe her first book is Republican Politics and English Poetry, 1789 to 1874, Paul Grave Macmillan. So you can see that a wide trans-historical approach. And I know Stephanie's work well. It's exceptional on prosody and such. Although this is the first time I've met you, so I'm super excited about that. Ewan Jones is university lecturer in the 19th century at Cambridge. He also has published scads of articles on wide interest, just like Stephanie, and is working, he's actually joining us from Switzerland? Sweden, the dumb American in the Midwest. And he has a book on Cambridge University Press, Coleridge and the Philosophy of Poetic Form. And Ewan and I met at the Coleridge summer biannual conference. And we really hit it off, and we found out that we were writing about exactly the same things at the same time, and that was really exciting. So what we're going to do, the format for today is we're going to talk through how we teach prosody in the classroom, what that is, how we conceive of it, what kinds of forms we use, and so forth. And I'm mostly just going to ask questions and let you guys sort of talk back and forth, and I might kind of butt in occasionally. So I guess the first question I have for you guys is like, you know, how much prosody / meter do you actually teach? And where does it come in and at what levels? And then I have some sort of follow-up questions. If you want to maybe start with that, and we'll see where that goes.
I can go first. So I teach basic prosody in almost all the classes that involve poetry, which is to say always in the introduction to the English major, which I teach almost every year, and then in a romantic poetry survey, which I teach every other year, and then sort of as needed in other classes. And I teach what I think of as a really basic version of this, thinking about how to recognize iambic and anapestic rhythms. I teach sort of traditional foot scansion of how to divide a line into feet, and how to give students a sense of an ability to hear more and talk about more by being able to do this sort of basic division. I don't usually teach them any other feet except iams and anapests at this initial level. But I want them to be able to notice places where they have a hard time identifying what the meters are, how they want to scan it, and then we look at those places of difficulty actually as places of interest. So I'm not interested in having them be able to perfectly scan lines and feel confident and hold forth about the scansion, but in using the scansion as a tool to direct energy to interesting moments in the passages. And then as they get more and more comfortable, then the confidence grows, and other sorts of investigations become possible. But sort of at this early level, it's just about, hey, the rhythm is interesting here. How do we begin to diagnose what the rhythm is? How do we begin to see where it makes sense to us and where it doesn't? And I usually put this in a big historical trajectory, especially in the intro to the English major course, where we say early on, we trust meter. Later on, we trust rhythm. And then the 19th century is so fun because we never know which we want to trust. So sort of look at some Shakespeare sonnets or Donne. I teach a lot of Donne in this context, and say, here, when we're not sure, we have a conflict between a kind of interpretive stress and metrical stress, we're going to trust to meter and see what that does. And then we look at Wallace Stevens and we have the exact opposite inclination, and then some Keats sonnets or Wordsworth or something in between, right? So like I said, I'm not trying to inculcate prosody per se, but prosody is one of the tools you want in an analysis that will get you to moments of conflict, tension, complexity, nuance in individual poems.
Yeah, so there are lots of similarities there. I might just say, first of all, it's so lovely to hear Stephanie talking about this with this palpable enthusiasm, and partly I think because prosody is taught less than it used to be, and it's also such a source of unease, not just for our students, I speak for myself, but also lots of us who teach. And I think what Stephanie said about sticking with the unease and making it generative, making it productive, is one of the most important things for me. But on a more practical level, I mean, I do teach it often, and I'm lucky in being able to do that, I think, in Cambridge, partly, well, for a couple of reasons. So we still have the course called Practical Criticism. It goes back to the I.A. Richards days, of course, where we're giving students short texts that they might not have seen before, many of which are verse extracts, because verse tends to work quite well in that setting. And whilst it's certainly not obligatory for them to talk about prosody in those texts, that often ends up being one of the things that is important if you want to get a sense of those poems. And then the other, and I consider this a real privilege, I think, because so much of how you teach prosody has to do with the kinds of group dynamics in the place that you happen to teach, which varies, of course, very widely depending on across the Atlantic, or the sorts of universities that we all teach at. I consider this a great fortune, again, that the class sizes tend to be reasonably small, so between 5 and 8 students. And that sort of size works quite well because you need it to be small enough so that you're not lecturing. That's the worst thing you can do with prosody, giving a series of normative or semi-normative rules. So you want to be working with them, and you want them to be testing it out themselves, but you don't want it to be 1 student or 2 students, because really you want to, if you're going to do what Stephanie was talking about a moment ago, sort of put some of that those strong productive ambiguities to work. It's really great if you can make that concrete with regard to 2 or 3 students that might read the same line differently, and you can then reflect upon that difference as a way of opening up some of those big philosophical, social, historical questions as well. That's for me the main reason for doing all of this, for going into that level of granularity, to begin to ask some very, very big questions.
I totally agree with that. And I think also the class size matters, I find, because I find I have to work some of this scansion and prosody work into assignments that students are doing, and there have to be multiple assignments. So for example, they have to be doing pre-writing in relationship to a paper, where one of the things they're looking for, among a whole list of others, metaphors, syntax and lineation, also is scansion. So they have to do this multiple times, and then I have to be able to comment on that and say, here, I actually think this is wrong, and this is interesting, and this is what, and you can't do that if you have 40 students in a class. You can't collect 3 or 4 of these kind of generative assignments. But if you're lucky to have 5 to 8, I'm very happy if I have 12 to 15. And so I feel if I have around that number, I can actually assign that kind of thing. And then also this goes to the point of students being able to realize that it's a tool that they can use. They have to use it a bunch of times. We wouldn't expect any other tool in the world to to make sense after one go at it, right? Like a hammer and a nail. So you have to keep using it.
Let me jump in for a second, because I think it's really interesting, and it'd be useful for people that are partaking of this, and thinking about how they teach prosody in the classroom, because now we have 5 to 8 and 12 to 15, and I have 32, like when I teach my intro to poetry class. So when I teach my intro to poetry class, I really have students break down into groups and work, and I sort of move between them. And I oftentimes, I mean, the limitations of a place become the thing that help you to grow, you know. And so the limitations that I have here is I have students who are not really necessarily well trained in poetry at all, and so that's great. I catch them like boom, you know, like there's something really wonderful about that. And also I end up teaching not just British literature and not just Romanticism, but also I am the poetry guy at my campus. So I end up, you know, referring to, as much as referring to Wordsworth, I'll sort of blend Wordsworth into Pound, and then Pound into Zhukovsky, and Zhukovsky into Creeley, to be able to explain to them the difference between what you were talking about before, rhythm and meter, the difference between this sort of dictates of the music of the line versus the speech situation, or what else is happening. And it's so it is possible to do, but I agree, like right now I'm teaching an upper division Romanticism seminar, and I have 7 students, and we can really get granular, but it can be done. I just want to sort of plug for the bigger group.
Absolutely. And I actually think you can even do it in lecture a little bit. And it's one of the things that you can model in lecture. I have a class that I teach that's 48, Enlightenment to Modernism. And in those lectures, I often include this, just not like, here's the day we do meter, but as a lecture on a particular poem. This is going to be one of the things that I say.
Excellent. So what I sort of pre-circulated some questions, and one of the questions I pre-circulated comes out of my own experience of working with colleagues who are skeptical about traditional scansion. And a famous book by somebody we all know began with, "I don't believe in iams," right? Right. So there's this kind of, and of course that's, you know, that was a sort of tendentious thing. I mean, it was part of the book project, but I wonder if, so I asked you, you said that you teach traditional foot scansion. I wonder, so this question is a little bit nuanced. Do you teach sort of, how do you deal with like some of the other, do you bring in some of the other kinds of scanning techniques or ways of talking about meters, such as Attridge, or even Thel, or, you know what I mean? Like different ways of understanding that. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so and this is one of the interesting things for me in terms of teaching prosody is where we sort of park our research interests. So as I know David knows, maybe I think Stephanie, I'll talk to you about this as well. Actually, you know, I of course have a deep history and a deep interest in the history of prosody and the way in which, you know, the end of the 18th century, Joshua Steele and people like Thel will come along and really challenge that conventional foot-based model. It's so tempting to fill my students' heads with this history, which I think is fascinating. There's a danger to that as well, because you don't want to overburden them with too much too early. Myself, and again, I completely agree with what Stephanie said a moment ago in terms of thinking about different forms of scansion as being tools that might work in some situations and less well in others. So I'm very pragmatic. I'm not at all interested in finally solving once and for all the mode of scansion that is proper to English verse. I say to my students from the start that there are different vying ways of understanding poetry, partly as a means of easing the anxiety that they might otherwise feel, that there has to be a normative answer or a normative approach that one might use. And in this respect, I find that a text that I often set quite early on is Derek Attridge's essay on rhythm in English poetry, the one he published for New Literary History. It's the one that starts with James Morrison. So it starts with nursery rhymes, which I think is just a lovely way aside from what approach you prefer, a lovely way to get students to think, okay, I'm applying something not just to this elite, highfalutin form of culture that we stopped doing anyway in the 20th century with free verse, you know, that's often the received story, but this is something that's media and diffused across culture in something as simple, quote unquote, because we know that they're not really simple at all, as a nursery rhyme. And that Attridge article is also very good. I think it's to my mind the clearest exposition of both the difference between, let's call it a conventional foot-based metrical approach and a rhythmical approach, but also why those differences might matter in cultural terms, how that kind of thorny question might have consequences for the way in which you think about human bodies or how human bodies are in society, those kinds of things. So without wanting to overload them, continually trying to bring it back to the instinctive question of how you read those lines, James Morrison, so you can find a vocabulary to describe what's going on in your body without overloading them and always bringing it back to that Attridge text is sort of my go-to resource early on when I'm dealing with first years who are terrified of all this stuff.
Yeah, that's very good. I use something which I think is similar, which is Robert Pinsky's book, The Sounds of Poetry. And
oh, yeah.
I love this book, and students seem to find it helpful and reassuring. And Pinsky has a whole chapter. It was short. It's a very short book. But the introductory chapter says, why would we ever care about this? And he has two reasons that I think are beautiful. And one is that meter is one of the ways that poets talk to each other within and across time. So when a poet writes in a meter, they are in a conversation with all the previous poets who have taken up that meter and with the whole history of the meter. And we want to have some sense of that level of their conversation. And then the other thing he says is that we want to be able to talk about this thing that Ewan was just saying about how we experience the poems in our bodies when we read them silently, and especially when we read them vocally. So we want to be able to say to each other, I experience the rhythm this way without having to use a bunch of made up da-da-da-da-da-da kind of language, right? So then also by having some terminology and some agreed upon sense of how we can chart and describe this, then we're able to talk to each other about our individual experience of the musicality and the rhythm of these lines. And then if we have that, then we can apply it to anything. We can apply it to prose, we can apply it to hip hop, which I think this sort of goes to some of your later questions. I know we'll talk about later about poetry and music, but I think for my students, the idea that there's going to be an intense rhythm in a line of poetry is completely familiar to them from that context. So then saying, okay, so how do we talk about this? We can talk about it using the same terminology in both places. That seems really powerful. So in a way, because I'm so invested in that, an idiom, a language that will enable these kinds of conversations across media and across time, I don't want to go to, there's also an idea that this is all hogwash. Do you know what I mean? Like, to me at the undergraduate level, that is the last thing I would ever want to introduce. If I have students writing honors theses or master's students, okay, then we talk about that. But at this introductory level, I have like a deliberate naivete about it. Like, this is all we need. We only need a couple of things. They're totally going to work. They're going to work whenever we need them.
Yeah, so to bring it back to that great polemical start to Meredith Martin's book, I agree with her, obviously, in the sense that iams don't exist in any platonic sense. They're not out there. There's particularly great ways of describing the structure, the linguistic structure of English poetry, English vernacular in general. But they, exactly as Stephanie says, the fact that poets have acted over centuries as if they do exist, that means that they do exist.
Absolutely.
It's almost like, it's like a category like race. I mean, it doesn't really exist, but
and whether they're using them or not, right? Even when the poets are resisting it, they're resisting that.
That's excellent. So do you have students read poems in class?
Always.
Always.
And I often have multiple students read them. And I was thinking about this in preparing for the questions, like, I haven't been doing this semester and I should do it again. I sometimes say to them in a jokey way, like, read it as if you liked literature. Read it as if you weren't in a hurry. Like, let's just slow, because I think they get nervous, right? And so and then sometimes that will really open up a kind of space where they all of a sudden aren't rushing through and performing, but actually they're like, oh yeah, I do like literature. That would be me. And slow down. So yeah, like have it sometimes read it multiple times, same student, multiple students, spend a lot of time reading. I've just been teaching the prelude, and we had it was hard poem for them, right? And we had a day where we just read a huge section, like maybe 120 lines from one of the books. We said, I remember the conceit of this poem is that Wordsworth read it to Coleridge. So all these lines that we've been unpacking and puzzled by and trying to figure out, oh my gosh, which are the direct objects, which are the subjects of these sentences? The idea is that Wordsworth was going to read these out loud and Coleridge was going to get them.
Yeah.
So they just sort of say, okay, we don't, this is one of the ways we can be enjoying this poem. I'm getting kind of confusing, but I'm saying there's a whole like range of reasons why you want to be reading out loud. Comprehension, not comprehension, everything in between.
And I think the social context with which these pieces were delivered initially is really important, not as a sort of scholarly apparatus with a bit of extra knowledge to get a better grade. When you tell students this was the original context, you're not doing so in order to say, so do it like Wordsworth did it. So, I mean, I come back to the original question, do you ask the students to read out loud? I do, and I do it because rather than despite the fact that I know that that will make them anxious. Not all of them, but a lot of them get very, very anxious. I mean, they're anxious with prosody, and they're certainly anxious reading out loud. So I think it's a very delicate pedagogical maneuver that you've got to attempt in this case. And one of the things that's, for me, totally essential is to make them not feel that there has to be a strong normative, not only scansion, but way of reading the poem. So I noticed this particularly when I got graduate students that might have been educated in North America, and they are absolutely convinced that they are not reading Wordsworth out in the correct way because they've got an American accent.
Right, yes.
And it's a lovely thing to be able to tell them that I'm, despite being a quaint English chap, not reading Wordsworth in the correct way because I don't have a thick Cumberland accent. And we have no idea, we didn't have a phonograph to record Wordsworth as we did with Tennyson, so we have no real idea what it would have sounded like, but it certainly would have sounded very different to whatever we hear today from any British person hearing today. And that goes to show, I think, that prosody can be one of the really great ways of resolving what for us is a thornier issue than ever, which is how you are sensitive to difference in the classroom. And so that bites with prosody, I think, where you've got a sort of bad choice. On the one extreme, you've got some students that want to say, I can read any line of poetry however I want to. And you want to say, well, all right. And then on the other hand, you've got this sort of unhelpfully, restrictively normative sense of the correct way of reading it. A really good question that I find when you're reading poetry out loud is, what changes come about because of your body, your dialect, your background, when you're reading it in comparison to your classmate? But conversely, what are the things that, despite all of those many differences, your voice has in common with that of your classmate because of something that the poem is forcing upon you, something that's making you? So, Blake's Tiger is a great example of that. Get 10 students to read it, they'll read it in 10 different ways, of course, but there'll be some really salient similarities, commonalities, because that poem works on you in a very specific way.
Excellent. What about MP3 files? Do you guys ever use those?
I have not used those.
No,
that's not true. With Burns, I do, and sometimes when you get in Scots, which is so much easier to hear than read, that I have.
Yeah. I do use them in a slightly unusual way, I think. So for a long time, I did play audio files in the classes themselves, because I think it's and again, to try and rather than make them think, oh, now I've heard Tennyson do break, that's how it's supposed to be done, to make them realise that actually they might interpret it in a way that knows something that Tennyson didn't about his own poem even. But I've also started to, and again, I'm fortunate here because I teach at a place in Cambridge where you have a freedom with this, but I've started to sort of experiment with some of my students by sending them MP3 copies of poems, and I don't tell them what the poem is, and then they have to listen to it on their smartphone, because they all have smartphones nowadays, of course. And then I make them take a walk through Cambridge, through an area of Cambridge that they haven't walked through before, and then they find a park bench or somewhere to sit down on, and instead of writing me an essay about the poem, they record an oral essay into their smartphones, and then they send me and the class an MP3 of their. So we all do it.
That's
We all
nice.
there. And that's, I mean, interesting for me in a whole bunch of ways. In some ways it puts into pedagogical practice the stress that we all agree with on the embodied nature of cognition. But it also sort of cuts out some of the things that you tend to find with some of the features that you find in the written voice of students, where they're trying to impress with certain technical vocabularies. And actually, it cuts through all of that sometimes to get them to.
This is great, Ewan. And I mean, really, just to go back again, since really the purpose of these Hangouts is to talk about pedagogy. I mean, what you're doing in this moment is just really powerful, because what I do with students a lot, I'm actually also very lucky because I teach at a regional campus. So they don't care what I do for the most part. If I tell my whole students, we're going to go look at a tree, because Hopkins in his letter looks at a tree and he tries to figure out the inscape. We're going to go try to figure out the inscape, or the in stress, and we're going to stand around a tree and look at it. I can do it, but what you've done is you've gotten this. There's so much in the institution. There's so much institutionalization that happens with the students the minute they sit down in a classroom. I don't know what it's like with you guys, but I just notice it, that they're completely free in the hallways, they're completely free in whatever, and they get in the classroom and it becomes a sort of space where they are sort of disciplined in a way, and not able to kind of like access certain parts of themselves. And what you've done, I think, is really, really lovely. I do something, I assign a close reading paper in almost every one of my classes, and my students have never done close reading the way that I want them to do it, it seems. My colleagues are wonderful and I love them, but they have a different idea of what it means. And I tell them, I don't want introductory paragraphs, I don't want a conclusion, I want you to really roll your sleeves up and get involved with the poem on the level of its sound, on the level of the way that it acts on your body, on the way that it sort of resonates, and et cetera. And I want you to notice all of these different things and talk about it. But what's helped me is I've begun to ask them to record themselves reading the poem and submit that with the close reading paper. And I can respond to their papers so much better by listening to them read it. And I can hear things or think things that I wouldn't have heard or thought before.
And do they get anxious about that? Again, I'm thinking about the necessary tact and delicacy that as an instructor, as a you have to have in these cases when you ask them to, give you their voice in some ways. Is there a way in which you have to deal with that situation? Are they?
I think they're much more anxious about putting down their thoughts on whether or not this is a trochaic inversion, and they do, reading into their phone. And submitting it. And I tell them I'm the only person that's going to listen to it unless they give me permission. And sometimes then I make a mashup of people reading, and if they at last class replay it or something like that.
That's very cool. I've never done that, and I'm inspired, and I will begin to do that immediately. I have had students memorize poems or short sections of poems, and then often we will, the setting of 15 people is too many to share them, so we'd have like 2 or 3 little groups, and I bring tea, and they perform the poems for each other or recite the poems for each other, and then talk about, okay, what did I learn by doing the memorization? And that I find to be an amazing exercise, and the way that they reflect then together, having done this, and why did you choose this one for memorizing and not that one? This is all great, but that actually requires quite a lot of time for them to effectively memorize even 14 lines of a sonnet. That's a pretty substantial assignment, whereas record it, like that could be part of almost everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think we actually, and this is one of the reasons why this kind of form is so great, because I mean, this is Cambridge thing. I don't think it's a Cambridge thing or UK thing. I think we talk to one another very little about how we actually teach. So lots of my colleagues, I know their work, I love their work, I know that they are very passionate teachers because of the way they talk about their students, but I don't actually have much of a sense of what they do in the classroom. And I think we're quite bad at building portable techniques that other people might use. It's become a little bit of an obsession with me recently, just because I was reading the sort of history of literary criticism and it was making the case that what we need is kind of radical pedagogy, and lots of people make the cases for exactly that kind of thing. Critics that I really respect, Jane Gallup, D.A. Miller, people like that, and very often the radical pedagogy seems to involve sort of this amazing charisma of the individual critic, rather than a bunch of resources that we might develop together, evolve, change, alter in different kinds of ways. So, I mean, I would love it if there were some sort of centralized resource that we could all add to it that way. I mean, I've got my little ideas, but I know colleagues do other things as well. I mean, I was teaching a graduate class on rhythm, sort of cultures of rhythm course a while ago, and my technique generally had been getting students to do presentations, group presentations or individual presentations in the class. And again, I realised it's something to do with the rooms, the spaces in which we teach, where exactly as you say, Dave, it kind of kills various things. So again, I got them to record, they had to read a poem, I got them to record it in a particular place in the city, but they could decide where it was. So some of them, when you could see their different temperaments reveal themselves and where they chose to go. So some sat by the river. There was an amazing student, Rachel, a couple of years ago, who she was talking about some of Alice Meynell's poems that were about the experience of maternity, and she recited that she was doing this essay in a cafe, and it was an amazing thing because she incorporated into her reading of these poems what it was like to have a body, to be a woman with a body in a cafe where, as she was speaking, people were looking at her in particular ways, and so there was an amazingly sort of freighted political dimension to it as well, and I remain convinced that it's really important to think of ways in which we can get our students to be out of the closed, limited classrooms, lovely as they are, beautiful as they are, and into the world outside.
Excellent, excellent. I would like to maybe ask a final question, and then we decided collectively that we would look at a poem together and maybe talk about how we might approach that poem with students in terms of its prosody. And but first I wanted to ask you just a real personal question. How is it that you came to focus on prosody and meter and come to love it? I mean, I'll say for myself, it's because I'm a alternative student. I came to academia very late in life, and I was a professional musician for a long time. So for me, it was just built into it. I always had loved poetry on that level, and I always gravitated towards poets that seemed to foreground a kind of rhythm and metricality, and I was always engaged in it. And so the minute, and then I at Berkeley I studied with Stephen Booth, who is like a bit of a tyrant, but I just really loved the level at which the granular level at which we talked about poetry. So so what about you guys? How did it come about for you?
For me, similar. I actually remember in college as an undergraduate being made to, all the things we're talking about, being made to scan lines, feeling highly uncertain, it being a part of the literature classroom that I felt most alienated from and unequal to. And I remember taking a Shakespeare course and starting to realize that, hey, this is a level of the text, and I think it's not coincidental that it's Shakespeare, it's closer to drama. It's in this place where we imagine many, many different people voicing these lines differently. It's part of the premise of the thing rather than the idea that the way the author read it would have been the ideal way. So I remember in that class starting to realize that this was one of the keys you could use to open up a passage. And that's for me the way that I'm always trying to teach it, like I said earlier. And so I think if everything that we can do to give students enough confidence and kind of bring it down from a test and into a way that they can come into the poem. It's another point of access and of entry. That's the way to do it. And now for me, I'm thinking so much in my own work about, actually for many years, about the sensuous pleasures of poetic language and the relation between poems as they exist as written documents in books and as they exist in our own silent and vocal readings. And so that has been fueling my my way of teaching and my conviction in it. But in some really basic way, I want prosody and all of the modes of super formalistic reading, right? Modes of, like you're saying, dwelling in the poem in a highly detailed way, like those exciting moments where you spend half an hour on a single line or a single clause. I think those are moments where students start to feel that they can enter with all of their resources into the reading of poetry. And one of the resources is the ear and the body. And prosody is a main way that we can talk about that in a way that allows us to build it into interpretation, rather than talk about it impressionistically at the level of liking it, whatever, right? So like it's a point of entry, and a point of entry that actually opens up the deeper and deeper encounter with the poem. That's what I remember starting to realize, and what I'm always trying to create the conditions for in the classroom.
Yeah, that's again, it's just lovely to hear this this enthusiasm. Again, my experience reflects Stephanie's in many ways. I mean, I was always when I did my undergraduate course, I was quite good at analysing text poems very, very quickly and using the correct terminology, and not ever giving any of my emotional response to the texts. And so I was sort of good at it, and I had all the terminology, and I didn't ever risk anything with myself. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, the last thing I thought I was going to do was go on to research. I worked as a journalist and some other things for 3 or 4 years, and so I'm a big fan of hip hop, big fan of rap music, and I remember it dawning on me, and I think I was beginning at this point to think about going back into academia anyhow, and I was casting around for something to do, and I remember thinking about this poem by Freudian slip, this hip hop track by Eminem, "The Way I Am," and it was there in my head, and I found myself starting to analyse. It must have been a rainy Tuesday or something. I had some time on my hands, and thinking to myself, it's actually written in this amazingly regular anapestic tetrameter. And it was, it's sort of anapestic tetrameter. It was one of those terms that I'd known how to deploy when I was an undergraduate student, but it was like the terminology was the same, but it was suddenly performing this different function of exactly what Stephanie said a moment ago, finding a way to communicate this thing that was in your body to other people. And I mean, I'm retrospectively making the link now, because I thought about it quite in this way at the time. But I came to see in that moment, and following on from that moment, that there was a way that actually, so far from being diametrically opposed, the technical way in which we describe things and the affective response that we have to poems, hip hop, whatever it might be, they can work together. And so I had a sense quite early on in my research career, as distinct from my undergraduate career, that I wanted to find a way of bringing together that specificity, but also that love, that enthusiasm, that affective, that affective phenomenology of the poem. And I think that's the one consistent actually through all my published work and all the research I've done, trying to find a way, even or particularly in this extremely elaborate and developed vocabulary, to communicate that love.
I think this is really important, and I don't know what it's like at your universities, but at my university, prose fiction is ever more the default mode of literary analysis at my university. So the students are most comfortable with novels and short stories. It's what they want to write if they're creative writers, and by and large, probably 75% of our creative writers want to be novelists. Very few want to be poets. And I think poetry is big at Wesleyan, right? Comparatively, we have 2 people on the faculty who teach poetry writing, which is pretty amazing. Nevertheless, I feel like it's more and more about prose. And I think if we want to keep a space for poetry in the literature curriculum, we have to teach it in a way that will simultaneously be rigorous and scholarly and all these sort of things. But as Ewan is saying, like those actually for me are vehicles to get them into the study of older poetries in a way that they'll be able to talk about these affective responses toward, right? I mean, we're very good at talking about this with 18th and 19th century novels in the classroom and in popular culture, but somehow the intimidation that so many of us and our colleagues feel about prosody has meant that we've decided that we're just not going to talk about this level of poetry, because to talk about it, you need iams. So, okay, we just don't talk about it. And I think it's one of the reasons why students feel ever more that poetry is something that belongs either to hip hop and not to their academic life, spoken word poetry, whatever, or it belongs to highly arid, intimidating part of academic discourse, right? And so there's no sort of space in the middle. And
I think I think this is part and parcel with the fact that the new criticism focused on poetry so much that you know the way in which often still literary history is conceived, new criticism comes in and it took history out. It took the subject out. It became about this kind of analysis. I think it's a misconception or a of what new criticism was about. But I think that many of us that love poetry feel that we've been victims of this kind of story, this kind of narrative of the way that new criticism came.
The academy, I mean, maybe this is just a sort of too much of a tangent or a narrowly disciplinary question, but I don't think it's only that. We have all accepted this received story about new criticism and practical criticism were, and which is a narrow elitist Mandarin culture, etc., etc. So we all know that stuff, and it's not as if that doesn't exist. Of course, you can find it there, but when you actually, I've just been reading Steve Newman's fantastic book about ballad collecting from the 17th century to the early 20th century, and he shows just how much he reminds us just how much people like Warren are really interested in pop music, popular song, and we forget that because we want to retrospectively look at that time as being closed off, narrow in some way. And I'm convinced. I mean, for Cambridge, it's a different way as well. I'm absolutely convinced that something like close reading, broadly conceived, or practical criticism, broadly conceived, can be the most reactionary approach in the world, and it can be the most radical approach in the world. And the history of that shows that in spades. But the fact that there are people who've already done it shows that you can use it to upset conventional normative ways of thinking, defamiliarize texts, challenge exactly those distinctions between elite and popular culture. That's how I continually try and teach in that setting, practical criticism.
Right. This might be a good time to do two things. One is to transition to talking about the poem that we're going to talk about, and also to put in a small plug for the essays that we each have in a collection that specifically looks at romanticizing historical poetics. And so you can look for that in Essays in Romanticism and lovely essays by Stephanie on Claire.
Word can undo the effects. Entombed in disappointments, falling to our knees out of hell. The squirrel moves in the wind-blown grass, scurries from tree to tree.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see.
One reason I think
Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments.
This might be one that's more familiar to people that are straight up romanticists. But secondly, also because I know that the historical poetics people, friends of ours who are sort of trying to rethink meter and also kind of verse practices and the way they've been conceived. I know they treated this poem at one of their conferences and they write about it a lot. So I thought it would be a good point of convention about talking about how we might address this poem in the classroom. So Stephanie, do you want to read it?
Sure. Break, break, break. Break, break, break on thy cold gray stones, O sea. And I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh, well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh, well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea. But the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. It's such a great poem.
Yes.
It's hard to read.
Yes, it is hard to read.
This is often, I ask the students to read and then I say, okay, I was just teaching Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, so this was very effective. Okay, those of you who read out loud, like, what do you notice about it? Having tried to read it out loud. As like, I notice here there's a lot of tension between sort of forward thrusting anapestic kind of moments and then Tennyson thwarting this, like this oh comma well. That twice I had to navigate oh comma well, having worked up a certain kind of through enjambment in the third line. It's a sort of sense of, oh, okay, now we're going to begin to go. No.
When you said it was difficult to read it out loud, Stephanie, is that partly because it's metrically actually quite a curious poem?
Yeah,
or
I think so.
I guess also maybe because it's, the the history of its recitations.
Yeah. Yeah.
As well.
And like I said, I kept feeling that there were certain kind of metrical patterns that I would become comfortable in, and then immediately Tennyson would remove them. So that was also the difficulty.
So, and I think sort of, coming back to, again, a thing you said early on in our discussion, Stephanie, this is, I set this poem a lot for various reasons, and it is one of those poems that has that sweet spot, that hits the sweet spot, I think, between being structured enough so that you can feel like you can describe the patterns that are going on, but not so fully structured that it's whatever, unvarying tetrameter and trimeter. And it's actually it's quite a difficult thing to put your finger on what's going on in this moment. And I again, coming back to the discussion we had about whether you prefer a foot-based or a matridge sort of rhythm approach. When I ask my students immediately what they think about this poem, very often they have a sense that it's got a kind of order, but they can't quite say what it is. And the reason they can't quite say what it is because it seems to be really various. So they count the first two lines, and there are 3 syllables in the first one, and there are 11. So then the third line, and I would that my tongue could utter. So you've got quite a lot of syllabic variation, and so it doesn't seem to fit in with what they're used to in that respect. I think if you're on the Wikipedia page, it tells you the genre of this poem is an elegy, and it kind of is, right? Or a hybrid. I think it's a great way to read this as a kind of 4-beat, ballad poem.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then the first line is just a fantastic example of that. You want to show what an unrealized beat is. It's there in your first line.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because that really is one of the things that occurs to me so often is that if you perform this poem or read it aloud, it absolutely requires some space there, some acknowledgement of a rest, and yet it challenges your. He could say, "Oh break, oh break, oh break," but he doesn't. Right. Yeah. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also. Go ahead.
You go, Stephanie.
That you can ask students just to describe which which syllables in each line they think are going to receive more stress.
Mm-hmm,
Just sort of
mm-hmm,
just
mm-hmm,
think about beginning with just relative
mm-hmm.
stress. Where
Yes,
do you
yes,
really want?
yes,
And then just starting there. And you can do that with this poem because the
yes.
difference between the stressed and unstressed is pretty strong. And then look at, okay, what have we got and what's producing this? Like, why do we want to mark the ones that we mark? And then punctuation comes in and lineation comes in and alliteration. And then all of a sudden you can start to have a conversation about alliterative meters and how they're still echoing in here. And
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
as you say, the pauses, like, okay, that's one of the reasons why we're very sure break, 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 pause is part of how we're sure that we're going to have 3 beats now. It's sort of, so just asking, okay, where do you feel a special amount of stress in each line sort of opens up the prosody of the whole poem on all these different levels.
Yeah, yeah. It's all about pause, isn't it? So the more I look at it, the more I think it's a great example of Attridge's system. First of all, it's really students to think about unrealized beats, how the significance might take place in something that isn't there technically. So, it's always good to focus their attention on caesurae and those kinds of phrases. But I mean, one of the interesting things is that it just makes it really hard to enjamb, even when the syntax would guide you in that direction. So you've got, great syllabic variation, even though you've got basically this 3 realized beats, 1 unrealized beat. So even a line like, I would that my tongue could utter thoughts that arise in me, the syntax makes you want to enjamb, but because you've got those 3 beats, even though you've got a large number of syllables, because it's in this triple measure that the poem continually slips into, you've still got the enforced pause at the end of the line. And for me, the fascinating moments are the exceptions where that changes, where you've actually got a 4th realized beat rather than an unrealized beat. So a good example of that is the penultimate line of the penultimate stanza. Oh, for the touch of a vanished hand. That's one of the few lines that you could imagine running on quickly from that line to the next, because you've got 4 stress, I think. Oh, touch, vanished, hand. It's as if actually that hand, in a lovely performative way, the poem as a whole, that real sort of silence made word and word made flesh in that line.
I feel often, Ewan and Stephanie, as though the first 2 stanzas are in a different meter than the last 2, that they're in long meter. Isn't that what it's called? When you have a 4-beat line in the 3rd line and trimeter lines around it? Isn't that what it is? Is that long measure?
Isn't that ballad or?
No, I think it's, I thought it was long measure.
4-3.
Like 3-3-4-3. Wait, that's the way I read those.
3-3-4-3, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know what that's called.
So something shifts between the 2nd and 3rd stanzas because of that for me. And I wonder if you guys have the same feeling.
I think syllabically it's pretty free. I mean, within constraints, of course, it's not all over the place. But I very, very strongly believe that tetrameter and trimeter and those sorts of words are not the right words to use with this poem. And again, it kind of comes back to the question of what's the best toolkit to use in the case at hand.
I see.
All sorts of things are being written at this time. I mean, Meredith Martin has written very well on this. This is a moment at which Victorian culture is totally obsessed with ballads, by which they mean these very, very, very regular 8/6, 8/6, 8/6, 8/6, 8/6, 8/6, 8/6. And I can sort of see where you're coming from with the longness here, because it seems syllabically excessive with regard to that. But my sense is that the variations are pretty continuous throughout, and it makes it hard to specify it with the specificity that you expect from the kind of foot-based model. So I would rather say it's by those standards it's pretty free, but by the number of beats per line it's actually less free than that, and that's the thing that's kind of forcing.
Exactly. That's what I was sort of gesturing towards, is as a kind of almost sprung rhythm or something. You can kind of get, or not sprung rhythm, but just counting stresses and not counting syllables.
But I still think you're onto something, David, about this transition between the 2nd into the 3rd stanza. And I keep sort of looking at it with that in mind, and seeing the "and" that begins the 3rd stanza. So there's this on the one hand, the and seems to suggest we're just going to have more of the same. But I agree that something changes, and it seems very significant now that you point this out, that we don't get an exclamation mark till the end of the third stanza, and that third line, but oh, for the touch of a vanished hand, as we were saying, I think is pretty clearly a 4-beat line, and it's such a sad line. It's the moment where we start to get the elegiac and pathos sense of the poem, and yet metrically it's much less uneasy. It's much nicer, and it has that nice comma. So I'm more and more thinking that you're really right, that there's something that shifts between 2 and 3, and it's happening metrically, and it's also happening syntactically.
I almost can't help thinking with this poem, and this I know I'd be castigated by my historical poetics friends who don't want to think about voice and don't want to think about subjects. But I almost can't help thinking that Tennyson is always seems to me to be caught between a kind of almost infantile, anger about loss and a kind of Christianized acceptance. And it seems to me that it moves from this infantile anger to a Christianized acceptance. And I know
very
that's
interesting.
And for me, that tension in Tennyson is so productive and so interesting.
Yeah, there's a from Emily Tennyson's journals, put an entry in 59, I think, when she's saying. She talks about a friend, a common friend of theirs whose child recites "break, break, break" in a very sweet fashion, and it's like some kid, with a squeaky voice, like an 8-year-old doing a rendition of King Lear's "Never, Never." It seems like a strange thing, but maybe it's not a strange thing, because there is something. We know this was a very common thing for the Tennysons, the family as a whole, to get their. Phyllis Welliver has written about this at length, very, very well, about the way in which these works were able to stand in a very large variety, surprising variety of social functions that to us seem mutually exclusive, but that says maybe more about us than it does about them. And so I'm convinced that what you just said, David, can be perfectly reconciled with a thoroughly historicising account of social receptions and performances of this work.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. And I've been thinking about a related set of issues in relation to church music and hymnody and psalm paraphrase, and trying to imagine, are there ways we can talk in a specific way about multiple points or multiple ways of experiencing it when you're singing it aloud in the congregation, when you're reading it in the hymnal at home, and when you're reading it with a study guide to the Bible, sort of thing. And I think, you can see in this poem similarly that there's a way in which the poem has the resources to be experienced in multiple ways, and so we can begin to account for some of this pliability or flexibility in the poem, not just kind of in terms of the social and familial history in which we can reconstruct it actually being used, but in a set of divergent cues that are present in the poem itself, and a way that the poem has simultaneously a kind of naive voice and a Christian voice, and it has hopelessness, and so also it has sound and silence. The poem is all of
Excellent. And go back to where we were. Let's see, how do I do that? I have to unshare. Everyone's getting, wait, let's see. Stop share. There we go.
There we are.
So I want to just ask you guys if you have any last thoughts. I mean, we kind of went, to me, we barely got started, and it's already been an hour, almost an hour. So, I'm, as a good psychoanalytic kind of person, I don't want to go over too much. So why don't we just, if you have any last thoughts or ideas you'd like to put out?
No, I just want to thank you both. This has been inspiring and exciting, and I can't wait to put it into further action.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could keep on talking, but we probably keep on talking for so it might be that formally end it
Formally
now.
end it.
Thank you again, Dave, for setting this up.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, absolutely, guys, and I look forward to being with you again soon. And I'll talk with you all later. And thank you everybody for watching and listening. Okay, bye.